Hello and welcome back to Supposedly Fun. My name is Greg and I am here today to look at the ALA Notable Titles for 2023. That is the American Library Association's Notable Fiction Titles for 2023. And just like the Pulitzer Prize, it is awarded in 2023, but it is for books that were published in 2022. So we're looking at books that were published last year. One of them won the Carnegie Medal for Excellence in Fiction. We'll talk about it. And I like to think of this as a sort of springboard for my Pulitzer Prize predictions and starting to compile a list of books that might win the Pulitzer Prize for Fiction. I usually release my prediction video in March, and the Pulitzer Prizes traditionally are awarded in April. They did get away from that during the pandemic, but we should be getting back on schedule. Hopefully they will not be delayed. There isn't really any book award or critics list that you can look at and try to use as a reliable indicator of what will win the Pulitzer Prize for Fiction. There was a period recently where the ALA notable list was a fairly good indicator. There were a couple of years where the winner came from this list. And then they've kind of gotten away from that again. We've now had 2 years in a row where the winner of the Pulitzer Prize was not on the ALA notable list. First the Night Watchman and then the Netanyahus last year. So we're back to that phase where there really isn't any reliable indicator for what might win the Pulitzer Prize for Fiction. It's just the way it is. However, it's fun to speculate, and as I said, this really just forms a springboard for me to start thinking about what might be on my prediction list and what might win. And it's always a good list, so I thought it would be interesting to run through it really quickly and just give some offhand predictions about whether or not the books in question might be a winner of the Pulitzer Prize for Fiction when we get to that announcement. So let's dive in. There are, I believe, 11 titles on this list. I don't own any copies, but I have read some of them, and some of them were new to me when I saw them on the list. Usually it's a really great tool for discovery, and I love long lists and critics lists for that in the first place, so it's just a good time. The first book that is on the ALA Notable Fiction Titles for 2023 is Elsewhere by Alexis Schaitkin, and I hope I pronounced that correctly. They have a very short blurb about each book, maybe 1 to 2 sentences long, and I'm going to use those. I know something about most of these books that I can kind of fill in the gaps and talk about them, and the ones that I didn't know anything about, I already kind of looked at. And Elsewhere is one of the books. I had seen the cover. I recognized the cover for sure, but I didn't really know anything about the book. And I mentioned this actually in my video from last year's ALA Notable list, which will be linked down in the description box down below if you'd like to, go back in time and see what was on this list last year. Yeah, but it was with The Five Wounds, I believe is the name. And that book had only existed to me as a cover. I didn't know anything about it. And the ALA notable list is actually what got me to look at what it was about. The same is true for Elsewhere. I've definitely seen the cover, but I never actually looked at what it is about. Here is what they say. A dreamlike allegory about home, identity, and disappearing mothers. I looked into it a little further. It actually sounds really interesting. This is by the author of that book, Saint X, which is another cover that you may look very familiar to you. And it is about a piece of speculative fiction where it's a world very kind of similar to ours, but it's in an isolated village and mothers start disappearing. Nobody really knows why, but they sort of speculate why. And it's about female erasure in society, ultimately. It sounds like a really interesting book. I don't think, offhand at least, maybe once I sit down and think about it a little more, maybe it will seem like more of a Pulitzer contender, but this seems like it would be a long shot. But it does sound like a really interesting book, and I'm glad that the ALA notable list kind of prompted me to look more closely because, as I said, I've seen the cover and I just never kind of bothered to see what the book was about, and I'm glad that I know now because it sounds really interesting, for sure. And I don't think I would run out to grab a copy of it right now, but it does sound really interesting. And if you've read it, let me know what you thought of it in the comment section down below, because I am intrigued. Not enough to try to find a copy at my library or anything like that, but I could easily be swayed to do so. So if you've read it and liked it, let me know. And if you read it and didn't like it, let me know that as well, because you might save me some time. The next book is something that was familiar to me. It's The Haunting of Hajji Hotak and Other Stories by Jamil Jan Kochai. This was on the long list for the National Book Award for Fiction. I'll put my reaction video to the National Book Award long list down below. And it sounded really interesting. I never ran out and got a copy, but I have heard some really good feedback. It's felt like toward the end of the year, a lot of people really started discovering this book, and I heard a lot of really great things about it. I have not gotten a copy. I have not sought one out, but this definitely brought it back on my radar because I heard a lot of really great things about it, and it does sound like a very intriguing book. Here's what they say about it. Life, death, rebirth, and the complex lives of Afghans and Afghan Americans are shared in a surreal collection. Short story collections traditionally have had success with the Pulitzer Prizes. It's been a while, though. The last short story collection to win a Pulitzer Prize for Fiction was A Visit from the Goon Squad in 2011. And that is linked stories. It's not like a traditional story collection. And then before that, you have to go to Olive Kitteridge in 2009, which, again, feels like a novel in vignettes more than a short story collection because they all follow the woman whose name gives you the title of the book, Olive Kitteridge. And you'd have to go back to, I think, the year 2000 when Interpreter of Maladies won to get a true short story collection that won the Pulitzer Prize for Fiction. So it's been a really long time. And I don't know if that means that short story collections are out, unless they happen to be linked, but it doesn't seem promising. So that alone, I think just that matter of format seems to make it an uphill battle for this book. And from what I've heard about it, it doesn't necessarily seem like something that a Pulitzer jury or a Pulitzer board would go for. But, I'm definitely going to spend more time thinking about that because it is definitely something that a lot of people have liked. And if you have feedback on this book as well, please let me know in the comment section down below. The next one is Horse by Geraldine Brooks, who is a Pulitzer Prize winner. And that alone makes it an uphill battle for her because not many people have won 2 Pulitzer Prizes for fiction. There have only been 4, and a woman has never done it. I hope a woman does manage it someday, but I'm not sure this is the book that will get us there. They say, an oil painting and an equine skeleton are clues to uncovering the history of antebellum racetracks and the enslaved trainers who worked them. I've heard very mixed things about this book. I think the people who have responded most positively to it are people who are already Geraldine Brooks fans and really invested in her work and excited when she releases a new book, and people who are less familiar with her work or maybe even coming to it for the first time aren't as big fans of it. And that's kind of interesting. I definitely think that there are other books by Geraldine Brooks I would read before this one. I've only read March, the book that won a Pulitzer Prize for Fiction for her. And there are others that I would read first. Year of Wonders, for example, is probably the one I would most likely get to before any others. But yeah, I think this is a long shot for a Pulitzer, but I've heard mixed things. So I'm a little surprised to see it on the list just because, again, reaction has been a bit all over the place. But I guess all you have to need is for the people who are judging the ALA notable list to be people who enjoy it. Clearly they are, because it is on the list. The next book on the list is Seeking Fortune Elsewhere by Sindya Bhanoo. They say a glimpse into the lives of South Indian families, especially those of the women at home and abroad. Now, I looked this book up, and it did get a starred review from Publishers Weekly. It sounds fascinating. If you have read this, please let me know what you think in the description box, or sorry, the comment section down below, because it sounds fascinating. I don't know that I would run out and grab a copy, but it sounds really interesting. And I don't know about Pulitzer chances because the Pulitzer is supposed to go to a work that reflects American life, preferably. And the word preferably, it can be interpreted very differently. So this does sort of stray away from America, like in a strict sense. So that might make it a bit of a long shot. I'll think about it a little more, but this does sound like a really interesting book to me. And again, it is a story collection. So that again could be a mark against it with the Pulitzer Prize for Fiction. I know a lot of people watching this are probably not short story fans. I didn't realize how many people are opposed, seems strong, but let's go with it. Opposed to short story collections until I started up a channel and started really talking with people about books on social media, because I've always liked short story collections, but I understand that there are a lot of people who are not fans of them, but I am, and this sounds really interesting to me, and I would easily be persuaded to read it. I just don't think I'll run out and do it now. I have too many other plans for the next 2 months or so. But if you have read it, I would love to hear your thoughts in the comment section down below. The next one that we have is Stories from the Tenants Downstairs by Sidik Fofana. I have read this book. And what they say is, residents of a Harlem on the brink of gentrification offer a snapshot of life within their shared apartment building. So this again is stories, but they're linked. So maybe it has a bit more of a chance than the other story collections we've covered so far. I think this would be a long shot for the Pulitzer, but you never know. And what I liked about this book in particular is that it really deals with gentrification, I heard an interview with the author on, I think it was NPR's Book of the Day podcast, and he was talking about how he doesn't think anybody wakes up and thinks, oh no, gentrification is happening, gentrification is getting me. He wanted to talk about it through the lives of people who are experiencing the effects of it. And so you have the residents of an apartment building trying to fight against rising rents and just life in their neighborhood. And it's an interesting way of approaching the topic. And it does make a lot of points about gentrification and the difficulty of living in a neighborhood that is being gentrified without being heavy-handed or really specifically talking about, capital letters gentrification all over the place. It's much more of a human tale. I will also say each chapter is narrated by a different person in the building, and Sidik Fofana does a really good job making them all have very different voices, which is not something you see very often, and it is something that I really appreciate, because all too often it feels like you read a story collection or a book that has a large cast of characters in it, and they all sound exactly the same. Sidik Fofana has done an incredible job making them all feel like very different people with very different experiences and very different attitudes and voices and ways of talking. And I really appreciated that a lot. So this is a good one for sure. If you haven't read it, I would recommend it. It's a short book too. I think I listened to it on audio, and that was fun as well, because they have different people narrate the different chapters of the book. It's great. The next one is The Furrows by Namwali Serpell. This is a book that is really rising in my Pulitzer odds, because it just feels like it's everywhere on best of lists. It was on the New York Times best of list. I think it may have been on the Washington Post. Let me see if I have that in my notes. It was a New York Times top 10 National Book Critics Circle shortlist. I don't think they've announced the National Book Critics Circle award yet, but it is on it. So there's that. It doesn't look like it was on the Washington Post, but it's just been everywhere. So seems like it has a really good shot. Here's what they say about it. The long tale of grief haunts Cassandra after she and her brother Wayne go swimming and only she returns. That's a very short description. I think I've heard in longer descriptions that she sees someone who resembles her brother, but I haven't read it. Because it is so heavily about grief, I stayed away during 2022. I don't think I would really be able to dive into a book about grief right now even, but maybe later on in the year I could potentially be ready, because I've just heard so many really good things about this book, and that makes me very curious about it. So I don't know that I want to read a book so heavily about grief right now, although I was surprised by how much I liked The Guncle, which turned out to be very heavily about grief. I didn't really know that going in. But yeah, I might need a little more time for that. But if you've read it, let me know what you thought in the comment section down below, because I am more and more intrigued by The Furrows the more I hear people talk about it. So we'll see how that goes. And the next one is another that I have read. It's The Rabbit Hutch by Tess Gunty. This is the book that won the National Book Award for Fiction. I read it in the fall, and I liked it. I think there are some ways in which you can tell that it is a debut novel. I think there are areas in which it has almost too many characters and too many things going on, and it could have narrowed down its scope. It's a very ambitious book, especially for a debut. Let's see what they say about it before I talk about it too much. The legacy of a medieval mystic and an unexpected sacrifice spark a young woman's escape from her body and her Midwestern hometown. It's almost like the stories from the Tenants downstairs because it is, in a way, telling about the lives of people in an apartment complex that is called the Rabbit Hutch. They use the French name. Of course, I don't remember how to say the Rabbit Hutch in French. I don't speak French, but that is actually the name of the building. It translates to the Rabbit Hutch. So it's about the people. It's about the town. It's about America, essentially, which would make it a really good fit for the Pulitzer Prize for Fiction because it's very heavily dealing with American life. And you can see the ways in which this town has become economically depressed, the ways in which the people who live in this town have become depressed economically and otherwise. And it primarily follows it follows one young woman who has aged out of the foster system. She is living with 3 young men who have aged out of the foster system, and they are trying to get their lives going, figure out what they are going to do, how they can make a life for themselves when they have every disadvantage you could possibly imagine. There are a little too many things going on. I think there are at least 2 subplots you could cut out of the book, but it's a really good book, and I am very much looking forward to seeing what Tess Gunty does next because it's a very empathetic work as well, and that is something that I would really appreciate in fiction. So I recommend it. I think it has good chances for a Pulitzer as well, except for the fact that it won the National Book Award. I think sometimes when a book has already gotten fingerprints from other prizes on it, sometimes the Pulitzer stays away. So that's sort of the biggest mark against it right now. But I'll think more about it as I get ready to do my actual prediction video, but I think for the Rabbit Hutch seems like it would definitely be a contender for it. And so does The Swimmers by Julie Otsuka. Now, I read this, and I was not as much of a fan of it. And unfortunately, I've read one other book by Julie Otsuka, and I thought the same thing. That was the Buddha in the Attic. Here's what they say about it. An elegant meditation on loss, belonging, and the effects of dementia. And that is true. However, the way the book is described is that it's told in a chorus of voices from people who are members at a community swimming pool. Eventually, they discover a crack at the bottom of the swimming pool, and it is discovered that they can't fix it. So the community swimming pool shuts down, and it's about the impact on the lives of the people who go there, and in particular, someone who is in the early stages of dementia. Turns out, that's just a portion of the beginning of the book, which is already very short. It's essentially a novella, and I listened to it on audio. But that happens in the first third of the book. And then it becomes very much something else. So you follow to a nursing home where suddenly it's a chorus of voices that work at the nursing home. And then the last third of the book is a much more intimate story. You sort of drop the chorus of voices and you really just get a mother and daughter. The mother being the woman who is suffering from dementia. At this point, she is sort of full on experiencing the effects of dementia and is living in an assisted living facility. And I think because it feels so fragmented, I didn't really get into it. It felt like 3 different novels that never achieve liftoff for me, but clearly a lot of other people like it, especially since this is the book that won the Carnegie Medal for Excellence in Fiction. I don't quite know how the long list situation, I think that all of the ALA notable books are on the long list, and they just choose one out of them. This is the one they chose. So I guess I might be the cheese that stands alone when it comes to this book. And because Julie Otsuka has written 2 other books that have been sort of critical faves in the past, I think she is in prime position to be a sort of upset for the Pulitzer Prize for Fiction. And I'll spend more time thinking about that as I prepare my predictions video. But yeah, I think she's a contender. Will I be happy if it wins? No. It's not a bad book. It's just not one that I particularly enjoy. And I think it has flaws that keep it from working all that well for me. But again, clearly there are people who disagree with me because, yeah. Anyway, I'll leave it at that for The Swimmers. And the next one is Trust by Hernan Diaz. This is a book that has been on, let me pull up my list just to make sure I don't get anything wrong. Trust was a New York Times top 10 book of the year, a Washington Post top 10 book of the year. It was on the Booker Prize long list. It did not make the short list. It's been everywhere. It kind of feels to me like the Pulitzer Prize for Fiction is going to come down to either Trust or Demon Copperhead. Those are the two frontrunners. And I think there's absolutely a scenario where both of them are not even on the list of finalists. But they seem to be the really heavy hitters going into it. My heart wants me to vote for Demon Copperhead, which I loved. But right now, if you asked me to make a prediction, I would say Trust. I think it's the one that is most likely to win at this point. Here's what they say about it. The truth about an old New York family's fortune is slippery in this experimental novel told in iterative perspectives. Which version is real? So I read this recently, and it's told in 4 different parts. And I think only 2 of those parts are successful, and only 1 of those parts is really good. And the problem with that is that you have to get through, it's the 3rd and the 4th part of the book. So you have to get through half of the book before you get to something that's good. And I found that very frustrating. I really almost bailed on the book because I was horrifically bored for the first half. And I understand why people find all 4 parts fascinating. I understand why Hernan Diaz thought it was important to include all 4 parts, because when you have all 4 parts, it's 4 different ways of telling essentially the same story. However, I think you could have just gotten rid of the other parts, taken the 3rd part of the book, expanded it, included a lot of the other elements, and it would have been just as good. And that was the only part of the book that I really liked, responded to, and all of that. So it's the book that, if you ask me right now, I would predict is going to win the Pulitzer Prize for Fiction. However, I just feel like it's only half, really only a quarter of a successful book. So that's a little frustrating for me. But I see why a lot of other people like it. It's interesting, though, because as soon as I did a video where I talked about my feelings on the book, virtually all of the comments were from people who felt the same way about it. I don't know. Clearly a lot of people like it, but clearly there are a lot of other people who don't quite see what the fuss is. And that, to me, would make it a bit of a disappointing Pulitzer Prize winner. But, what do I know? The next book is Vagabonds by Eloghosa Osunde. They say shimmering characters from marginalized communities of a Nigerian metropolis are explored through a magical realist lens. And I know magical realism is another thing that a lot of people struggle with. Done well, I think it's very good. Now, Kirkus gave this a starred review, and it sounds really interesting. Their headline of it, or the blurb that they take from it, is Osunde revels in the joy of storytelling to render a city and its outsiders in all their flaws and glory. And something I'm going to have to dig into because I haven't done it yet. I believe all of the people on the ALA notable list are potentially eligible for a Pulitzer Prize for Fiction. There are some, I believe this author, Eloghosa Osunde, is born in Nigeria, but I don't know if she still lives there. I believe she's been educated in the United States. I haven't really dug into it, so I don't really want to say either way. But qualification and citizenship questions are a bit murky when it comes to the Pulitzer Prize. So that would bear additional looking into before I do my actual prediction video. But to me, this book sounds fascinating. It's, again, short stories. So don't know if that would be something that the Pulitzer Prize jury or the Pulitzer Prize board would respond to. But they also feel like they are very specifically about people living in Lagos, and they are gay, they are lesbian, they're transgender, they might not conform to gender norms. And it sounds fascinating to me. This is the one of the books that I have not read yet that I think I would be most likely to seek out. It sounds really good to me. And I'm really glad that the ALA notable list put it on my radar because it sounds fascinating. The final book on the ALA notable list is What We Fed to the Manticore by Talia, Lakshmi, Kolluri. They say 9 fables told by animals navigating a fraught world, which really doesn't tell you much at all. So I did some more research on this book to see what else it is about. It turns out it sounds really interesting. And if you're doing Montana Book Company's reading challenge for 2023, there is a prompt on that to read something told from the perspective of an animal. This is a book that would help you get there. It is a story collection. It's 9 stories, I believe. Yes, 9 stories. So again, if you're not a fan of short stories, maybe that's something you'd have to take into account. Obviously, that puts a little asterisk on this in terms of Pulitzer contention, because I don't know that a short story collection would be taken seriously for the Pulitzer anymore. It's been a long time since a true short story collection won a Pulitzer Prize for fiction at this point. So it's 9 emotionally vivid stories, all narrated from animal perspectives, exploring themes of environmentalism, conservation, identity, belonging, loss, and family with resounding heart and deep tenderness. So I think the little sentence that the ALA gives you might spark your interest, but I feel like once you look into it a little more, it does sound like a really fascinating book. And if you have read this, I'd love to hear your thoughts on it in the comment section down below. Let me know. So those are the books that are on the ALA notable list, and the winner of the Carnegie Medal for Excellence in Fiction for 2023, which is really for 2022. I would love to hear your thoughts on these books on this list, whether or not you think any of these are contenders for the Pulitzer Prize. Let's talk about omissions before we shut down this video, though. There are a couple of books that really surprised me, and the one that I'm most surprised to not see on this list is Demon Copperhead by Barbara Kingsolver. And I think the fact that it is not on this list, it's one of the things that is making me think that Trust has a better chance at the Pulitzer Prize for fiction. My heart still wants to vote for Demon Copperhead by Barbara Kingsolver. It was my favorite read from 2022. I'll put a link to that video down below as well. I'm just surprised it's not here. Obviously, I really liked it, but it was also on the Washington Post top 10, the New York Times top 10. You know, I'm surprised it's not here. There are also some books that have been showing up on a lot of year-end best lists, like The Candy House by Jennifer Egan. I don't know that that will become a Pulitzer Prize winner. I have to really think about it, because obviously it's a quasi-sequel to A Visit from the Goon Squad, which did win a Pulitzer Prize for fiction, and it seemed like people were really looking forward to The Candy House and then said nothing about it after it was released. And then at the end of the year, all of a sudden people were talking about how much they loved it again. So I really have to try to figure out what I think of The Candy House and its odds for the Pulitzer. But I'm surprised it's not here as well. Obviously, both books by Cormac McCarthy from last year, The Passenger and Stella Maris, are not on the list. I don't think people know what to do with the fact that there are 2 books from him. Do you lump them together and count them as one? Do you have to count them separately? Does one make it? Does another one stay off? I suspect that a lot of people just don't know what to do with those. French Braid by Ann Tyler, another previous Pulitzer winner, along with Cormac McCarthy and Jennifer Egan, is not on the list. I'm not that surprised, because that book seems like it mostly appealed to Ann Tyler fans and didn't really show up on a lot of critics lists or best of lists that I saw. I am surprised to see not to see Dr. No by Percival Everett on the list. And I think the fact that it's not on here really speaks to the fact that it was a bit of an unexpected turn for him after being a Pulitzer Prize finalist for a book called Telephone, and then releasing The Trees, which was a wildly successful book and really elevated his standing. I think Dr. No was just a bit of a departure from what people have come to expect from Percival Everett. And another one is If I Survive You by Jonathan Escoffrey, which was longlisted for the National Book Award but didn't make the shortlist. I think if they were at all interested in this, the spot on the ALA notable list probably went to The Rabbit Hutch, which ultimately won the National Book Award for fiction, but it is a little surprising. And then Nightcrawling by Layla Motley has been blanked again, which is interesting because when that book was released, it felt like it got a lot of attention. It was on the Booker Prize long list and then didn't make the short list. And it just feels like it's being left behind a little bit. I think it could be potentially a Pulitzer contender. but I'm going to spend a lot of other time thinking about it. Those are the books that I would say I'm most surprised did not make it to this list. But I'd love to hear what you think of the list, what you're surprised not to see on it, and all of that stuff in the comment section down below. As always, I really appreciate your time, and I will be back. Until next time, happy reading.